President Obama will leave office in 5.5 weeks. The new cover story in The Atlantic is called "My President Was Black," a history of the first African-American White House and of what came next. National correspondent Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, what Obama was able to offer white America is something very few African-Americans could: trust. He stands firm in his own cultural traditions and says to the country something virtually no black person can, but every president must, and that is, I believe you. Coates has written about President Obama several times over the last 8 years, and he joins us at the table to discuss President's legacy on race. How many words was this? Such a great read.
It was short. It was 17,000.
17,020 pages. Really, I am not knocking. It was a wonderful read.
You guys Twitter.
No, it was a great read, Ta-Nehisi. Congratulations.
Thank you.
But you write this. You said he could never have succeeded along normal presidential lines. Yeah. What do you mean by that? He needed a partner.
Well, he didn't really have one. I mean, traditionally, I think the president came into office thinking, that he basically would work with Congress, and he would start in this position and they would start in that position, and they would work together, and you would have this series of legislation that would be the result of compromise. That did not actually happen. Folks didn't even want to come to the table. Yeah,
you said his greatest misstep was born directly out of his great insight.
Yeah, and the great insight was that, in fact, it was possible, for the country to elect a black president. That indeed, the barrier of white supremacy actually could be vaulted, by a special individual, him specifically. But that actually, I think, also caused him to underestimate the force of it.
And because of his own upbringing.
Yes.
Yeah, but why didn't they come to the table?
Well, I think if you look at the long view of history, after 40 or 50 years, increasingly the parties have become racialized. Okay. So you can go racialized, right? So if you go, to certain southern states and you look at state legislatures, I mean, the Democratic Party is basically a black party. The Republican Party is basically a white party, and that sort of thing filters up, from the base, all the way up to,
the Republicans' opposition to Obama was based on race is not entirely fair.
I mean, say completely.
Yeah, I mean, you had a Democratic president who was talking about a massive expansion of what was Obamacare. I mean, there were significant policy differences. But back to your article, what do you think has Obama used to write about what he has meant to Black America?
Yeah, well, if I gotta just respond, I want to be really clear about that.
Yeah.
Very few, when you talk about like the force of racism anywhere, it's very rarely just I look at you and you're black or you're white and I don't like you. It usually is complicated in that sort of way, but I think it's very, very hard to ignore, and I put it together in the article. I mean, when you go from, Obama waffles during the primary, the birtherism, when you go through You Lie, when you go through, Sarah Palin telling him he has
during the State of the Union
policy,
address,
right?
Yelled You Lie.
The whole thing, about the first food stamp president. When you start hearing this over and over and over again, this has some import. You're right, it's not the only thing. Right. But the fact that it is a thing, I think, is objectionable to a lot of people.
Right. I just point that out because I was there covering the White House, and there were significant differences as well on policy. However, there were a lot of personal differences that people attributed not paying him the respect that he deserved. But you write so much about in this article about how Obama was able to become president, how he talked about race as president, sometimes how he didn't talk about race. Right. What did that all mean?
Yeah, that's the core of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think you really would have to struggle to find, and I say this, even with all my criticisms, the president that I have, you really would have to struggle to find an individual who would be able to deal with, the great difficulty of having to speak to a majority, white country while himself being rooted in a black experience about race. And, I think there is, one side that says he should have spoke more about it. I actually am not convinced that would have done, him or anyone.
That's criticism within the African-American community.
Yeah. There is. I don't know if that's the majority opinion. I wouldn't say that, but that definitely was a criticism. But I see very, very little evidence that actually would have helped. The times that he did actually speak out, the Henry Louis Gates instance, I don't know that it was particularly clarifying.
No, you also write that he had to straddle two worlds, and it was more than just straddling black and white.
Right.
He had to straddle two worlds. Talk about that.
Well, I think you can almost overestimate the fact that the president is biracial and say, well, that's why, he was able to, speak to both of these places. But it wasn't just that he was biracial. It was that he was born and raised in Hawaii, far from a place where the force of, the legacy of Jim Crow, is really there. He was born to parents who made him feel good about being black and didn't, weren't. I mean, you got to remember, Obama's born in 61. Yeah. His mother brings this black dude home, and the family's
and
like,
he said
okay.
African,
that's what he said. And they're like, okay. That is a very, very unique scenario for black people, biracial or not.
What did you learn about him that you didn't know going into these sessions that you spent with him?
It was more like I suspected things, and almost all of it was confirmed. He is, and again, I say this with all of my criticism and the disagreements that he's sincere. He's deeply, deeply, deeply sincere. The optimism is not a joke. It's not a game. It's not a put on. He's still optimistic to this very day. I don't think it's a joke. I mean, some of this might be a little bit of stagecraft for the country, but I think he really, really believes in the resiliency of American people.
And has he lost that optimism?
No.
Thank you.
No.
You call him a deeply moral human being, one of the greatest presidents in American history.
Yeah, I believe that. I believe that very much so.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, thank you very much. It is a good read. It's a long read, but it's a very good read.
Long.
Yes, it is, but it's very good.
You young people.
Yeah, it's very good.